If there's one thing we can thank Disney's Doug for, it's getting the ball rolling for Disney to start exploring the avenue of slice-of-life cartoons. The cartoon fantasy well was running dry, and surely their audience would grow into wanting to watch stories about themselves. Then you'd assume their way to go around it would be to make a sugary, light-hearted cartoon that does everything it can to show kids that life is perfect and that they have nothing to worry about. No. Recess was the game changer for Disney television animation. It was their first homegrown series not to conform to the Disney style, and to be completely about human kids. It gave their output a new identity very quickly. Okay, maybe a lack of one. You never knew if you were going to get
funky fresh moves.
But it was the true beginning of their second generation of output, and what a start. A show that treated elementary school like child jail sounds good on paper, but this was a very clever and relatable look into the lives of kids and how they're more like adults than you think. Recess was created in 1996 by Paul Germain and Joe... Paul and Joe. Paul and Joe had already made names of themselves in the bustling animation industry of the 90s, Paul being a co-producer on The Simpsons early on, and I mean really early on, leaving after episode 2. Something really is missing from these modern episodes. And while at Klasky Csupo, co-creating Rugrats alongside the studio's founders Arlene and Garber. Joe also worked with them writing on Rugrats and Duckman, before another Nicktoon grabbed their attention, Hey Arnold, for which Joe was a co-developer and prominent writer on the first season. So looking at their resume, they specialized in the writing of slice-of-life adventure shows with a sense of humor and some manner of hook for adults. And when Geraldine Laybourne, Nickelodeon's president for their slightly less terrible era, moved to ABC and the Disney Channel in 1996, she commissioned Paul and Joe to create a new cartoon for Disney's upcoming animated programming block, One Saturday Morning. What they came up with was the Recess Gang, a ragtag group of school kids always finding ways to make their time out of class into an adventure. It was developed over the course of the year and eventually renamed to simply Recess, but not before clips of its test pilot were shown in advertisements. Actually, these few clips were only made for advertising purposes. They never animated a full pilot episode in this style. Which is good because I prefer the final style, managed by longtime Simpsons character designer Eric Keyes. It's a lot more charming. The show's official starting point is a little scattered. It said there was a preview on August 31st, 1997, and the official premiere was to be on September 6th, but was pushed back to September 13th to make room for coverage of Princess Diana's funeral. But after that, it was smooth sailings, being the first and easily most acclaimed addition to One Saturday Morning. Critics praised the stories and characters, and kids latched onto it more than its contemporaries, Disney's Doug and Pepper Ann. No disrespect to either of them. Okay, maybe a little to Doug. Recess remained popular for a very long time, technically releasing 6 seasons across 4 years, 4 broadcast seasons on ABC, and 2 extra on UPN's 1-2 block. Disney did a lot of things to make their ABC shows look good, but they never treated them as channel exclusives. Indeed, Recess maintained a pretty long legacy after ending on November 5th, 2001. Reruns still aired on ABC until 2004, and in that time they made various movies to keep the brand chugging, and it was aired on Toon Disney, Disney Channel, and then Disney XD periodically up to 2009 to 2011. I was born the year it ended, and I still grew up with it, and that's not even mentioning the theatrical movie or the Lilo and Stitch crossover. This was Disney's biggest animated TV hit until Kim Possible came around, and it definitely deserved the attention.
I say it's time to go back there and find us the good food they've been keeping from us all along.
TJ, you gotta be crazy.
Maybe, but at least I'll be full.
In a quaint Arkansas town, there's a public school named 3rd Street Elementary, where the dynamic between the teachers and students is more out of control than usual. The kids have built their own society on the playground and field, where academic grades are social classes, rules are made to be broken, and it's every friend circle for themselves. The main characters are the friend circle led by TJ Detweiler, the 9-year-old bane of Principal Prickly and recess supervisor Miss Finster. Together, he and his chums learn everything they'll ever need to know about social science, politics, economics, and how to survive the 4th grade. So it goes without saying that Recess has a very strong satirical hook, treating everything about childhood like something mature and serious. Paul and Joe and the rest of the writers were smart though in penning stories that could appeal to anyone. Kids are naturally going to watch a show about kids, and adults, especially those going back to this show after watching it years ago as kids, will appreciate the sociological undertones. That is, if they're the kind of adults who spend their time watching decades-old kids shows. But why shouldn't they if they have a strong identity and interesting cast regardless of demographic? Theodore T.J. Detweiler is the 90s, a sly trickster with a heart of gold and a mischievous gleam in his eye, in the first season at least. He's the head of the Recess gang and the instigator of all their pranks and wacky schemes to extend recess, and all of this makes for an interesting lead. What works the most is that he's always a good friend and doesn't lose hope all too often. The gang's other strategist is Gretchen, a spindly child prodigy who spends most of her time experimenting with the world of science. She makes for a useful addition to the group, being the most academically gifted in all. Along with 2 strategists, the gang also has 2 fighters, Spinelli and Vince. Spinelli's an aggressive, tough-as-nails kid who no one wants as an enemy. She's no punk though, she does have a very pronounced, soft, feminine side. These complementary traits make her one of the most compelling characters by far. Vince is much nicer, and is the most athletic kid in school, being able to master any sport one can throw at him. In the off chance the gang needs some sporting help, or the problem of the week is sports related, he can make an okay protagonist, but I felt he was the least developed of the main 6. Not a waste at all, they do give him a fair amount of layers and spotlights, but his specialty was probably too niche. The gang also has 2 pacifists, sensitive members who usually keep them grounded in a positive state of mind. Mikey is the big-hearted softie, and the most likely to make peace with an enemy. His main interests are poetry and singing with Robert Goulet's voice, so expect a lot of those in his episodes. Mikey was my favourite back in the day, and I still think he adds greatly to the dynamic. Their latest recruit is Gus Griswold, the shy, emotional new kid who needs to learn all the rules and schoolyard legends. Ironically, his father's a military commander, so he's got some strong blood that he still has to hone. Gus does an excellent job rounding out this balanced and varied group. It's telling that as he's integrated into their group, the show takes on a more positive tone. Their most immediate adversary is Miss Finster, a mean, crabby teacher who supervises recess every day and keeps an especially strong lookout for any form of trouble. As strong of an authority figure as she is, she left an impression on most people I knew. She could get pretty scary early on, but they still treat her like a person with her own past and interests, which is nice. Principal Prickly is the stern, jaded principal of 3rd Street, and TJ's main rival. He always looks out for himself, always feuding with his brother, who works at a slightly more sophisticated school, and begging Superintendent Skinner, nice, for a job at a middle school. He's all too caught up in being rich and successful, and it's had a negative impact on the school, so it's a miracle that he manages to be an interesting anti-hero so often. One of the only teachers that the kids are on good terms with is the 4th grade home teacher, Miss Grotke, a refugee from 60s hippie culture all about free speech, compassion, and being serious about American history.
And so the noble Native Americans shared their bountiful foodstuffs with the undeserving European savages. And that's why we call this holiday thanks...
Attention, please.
I guess the joke back then was that she was a bit too liberal to be working at a public school, but it's kind of a nice thing to see, and she's a good teacher all the same. She fulfills the role of being one of the good ones. That's not to say the playground is any paradise. Randall is Mose Sislak's long-lost son, and a snitch for Miss Finster, always reporting any mischief or conflict in exchange for cookies. He's one of those characters that you're meant to love to hate, but they slowly explain why he's so ostracized from his peers and dependent on gossip, which perfectly builds on the instances where you're meant to love hating him. King Bob is the 6th grade monarch of the playground, maintaining order and making up the rules. I really like how the kids have this bigger power to look up to, but also question a lot of the time. They make his responsibilities clear, and his cold personality clearer. The Ashleys are an exclusive club for 4 rich, popular girls, all named Ashley. They even have their own clubhouse on school property. I still don't know how that was allowed. If there's ever an episode about being popular, or if one of the girls needs to be gussied up, the Ashleys will be there for them as frenemies. The kindergartners are depicted as primitive savages, designated to their own play area where they can have the loudest, most chaotic recesses possible. I guess Paul and Joe couldn't completely let go of Rugrats. I don't mind them though. They're able to bring some fun stories with them, and I especially like the ones that slowly warm up to the big kids. There's a bunch of other great characters that all have their own little function. The Guru gives life advice, the Diggers are construction workers in the making, Menlo is the stuck-up secretary, and Butch tells horror stories. Cornchip Girl likes corn chips, and Swinger and Upside Down Girl are self-explanatory. But I can't help finding something familiar about Upside Down Girl's voice and dress. Hustler Kid hawks merchandise, Owen Lawson's a bully to all below the 5th grade, Knarf leads a society of pale anoraks who spend their recess role-playing. I could be here all day, the list goes on. I won't believe you if you've never seen one of these kids yourself in primary or secondary education. This playground can get pretty dog-eat-dog at points, but it never stops being relatable. But some of the unsung heroes of the show are the families to the recess gang. They totally explain why they are the way they are. TJ's parents are loving, Gretchen's and Mikey's are nurturing, Spinelli's are embarrassing, Vince's are every black 90s sitcom cliche, I mean his brother's an Urkel parody, and Gus has a military family, as mentioned before. Sorry for speedrunning the tertiary cast, but if I kept going on with a roster this strong, I'd run overtime. I hope you know what I'm trying to say here. Almost everyone's developed and integrated well. The only constant character I don't like is Gordy, whose personality is that he doesn't want to be friends with TJ. That's all he's there for. It's a tough thing to deal with, and his only spotlight episode is pretty weak, but to me it's weak because I can see the potential in a character like this in a show like this. But aside from him, yeah, excellent lineup.
Soon other girls will be considered cooler than us, and if we're not careful, by the time we're in junior high, our first dates will be with guys named Paul or Joe. Oh!
Recess is a slice of life show. I've already talked Doug, a lot of the same conventions apply. The setting is realistic, jokes are there but not the main attraction, and the stories are usually simple morality tales. Recess's gimmick was basing itself on prison movies like The Great Escape to get across the feeling that 3rd Street is kid jail. Now, I'm no prison movie authority, but I have seen plenty of Toy Story 3 in my day, so I see school and prison meld nicely for this corporation. The allegories and references are rather overt early on, but faded out over time as it eventually took on the bigger picture of Western culture. It's able to tackle societal themes you didn't really see in children's media at the time, like class struggles, blind faith, nostalgia, economics, slavery, and social credit systems of all things. You might be wondering if they're wondering how any 7 to 10-year-old kid is going to understand what they're on about, but it's all very articulate in its themes while never talking down to that demographic. Even in a normal childhood scenario, like learning swear words, TJ invents a harmless slang term out of a Mario enemy, then he's taken to court over it because Prickly's afraid that it's going to encourage and spread profanity. These stories aren't really told for one audience or another. They cast a very wide net for who could get something out of them. It's impossible to please everyone, but for Paul and Joe, that was more challenge than proverb. Now, just because there's a lot of serious storylines doesn't mean it's this edgy, hopeless world. It's normal and chill just as often, and the friendships within these friend circles are believable. For every mature, cautionary tale, there's a relatable mishap the following week, a few of which were based on the experiences of kids the writers knew, or their own, which lent the stories a more credible air. The art direction and animation on Recess sticks out in how little it sticks out. Character and prop designs are more realistically colored and proportioned, exaggeration is used but not as cartoonish as other shows, and there aren't any gimmicks like rainbow skin colors or abnormal head shapes. This isn't a negative criticism of the show, it actually works in its favor. If you want these problems to feel believable, of course that would show in the art and animation. I'll say the fantasy sequences are pretty dated though, they couldn't look more 90s if they tried. but they're a small part of the show and have their own charm anyway.
Just where do you kids think you're going?
The first season was the one most clearly inspired by prison movies, and you can really tell they wanted to implement that vibe of constant punishment and claustrophobia. Some moments are pretty heavy for a Saturday morning cartoon, and much like Codename Kids Next Door, even the main cast starts off as a ragtag group of anti-heroes before you really get to know them. Everyone's still in the making, and some of them take longer to click than others. Sorry Gus, you're given a fair amount of focus this season, but tend to be less consistent. Miss Finster is definitely more evil here, they toned that down eventually, and Principal Prickly isn't seen as much. It's one of those season 1s that's tough to go back to after seeing the later ones, but that doesn't mean it's bad at all. It established its setting and tone quite well, and plenty of episodes stand tall on their own. I'd still recommend you start here.
Hey, they can't keep us in here forever.
Please remain calm. We've got the best experts in the country flying in right now. You'll all pull through. I hope. They're so young. So young.
Goodbye prison vibes, hello everyday school vibes. I don't know which are more crushing. But seriously, the tone of season 2 is considerably more optimistic than in 1. It's less about how hard the challenges are, and more about getting through them. There's still some sober storylines like Gus standing up to a bully 4 times bigger than him in Gus's Last Stand, or Pharaoh Bob where the playground turns into an ancient Egyptian kingdom, but character development was a bigger focus now, with a lot of aspects to the characters' lives only glimpsed in season 1 being better fleshed out now. You've also got a new addition to the core lineup, Gretchen's virtual assistant, Galileo the Frog. Why wasn't he on more promotional material? It was also home to the first holiday special. Yes, Mikey, Santa does shave. The holiday trinity was pretty unbalanced overall. 2 Christmas specials, 1 regular Valentine's Day episode, and 2 semi-Halloween specials. At least Christmas was given the most spotlight. This episode is a tale about Mikey being questioned about the existence of Santa, not something you'd see in season 1, which is why it's a nice indicator of where the show is going.
What are we looking at?
I don't know, but did you guys ever notice the school has a big clock on it?
Now, here's that Disney season madness I was expecting. After 2 13-episode runs, Recess's 3rd year consisted of only 8 new episodes on ABC, but 23 new ones on UPN. Fans have decided to call these different seasons, which is a headache for me, especially since they were clearly made at the same time. Guess what? It's a 31-episode Disney run that's by technicality the best of the bunch. Not that I can complain here, this is a pretty classic collection. It's a brighter world with brighter colours, a sign that the Cell era was coming to an end. Sure enough, some episodes here were coloured digitally, and they don't look that good frankly. Finer details were sacrificed, and the outlines look way more rough, even compared to other conversions. This season basically followed on from what season 2 had started, to the point that the darker episodes are now more experimental in nature. The Biggest Trouble Ever and School World might not be my cup of tea for this sort of show, but I get why they were made, gotta keep pushing the envelope. On a minor note, this was the first time they did a 2-parter, with one story directly leading into the next. 2 weeks later. Bigger season, bigger room for error, I get that, but they're small compared to all the good things it brought us.
Bacon! Don't resist or I shall crush you.
Run for your lives!
I'll lump these 2 seasons together as well, since it's only 8 more episodes overall, aired across 14 months and 2 channels again. It gives the impression that these are table scraps, and they're certainly not as strong of lineups as 4, but there's still some great stuff in here. Again, not much different from 2 to 4, they hit their stride and didn't look back, and I can respect that. I still wonder why they didn't air them all before the release of Recess School's Out, which itself was delayed from summer 2000 to February 2001. I don't want to say Disney lost interest in the brand, considering what comes later, but they certainly weren't used to keeping cartoons going for more than 3 continuous years. Didn't stop them from trying. But what are my favourite episodes from these 4 years of 4th grade? First name Ashley gives us our first big secret about Ashley Spinelli, and serves to introduce you to the Ashleys and their motives. It's one of the first big, friendly episodes too, so it's got that pulling it up. Here Comes Mr. Perfect is read these days as a parody of fantastically perfect self-inserts who can best every pre-established character at everything, but it's a great episode too on its own about first impressions and coming off as an arrogant saint. The newer context it can be viewed in makes it pretty fascinating and one of the more relevant ones. A Career to Remember is one of the most clever and distinct episodes because of its broad subject matter. Everyone except Spinelli knows what they want to be when they grow up, but she's later told by their career day guest that she doesn't have to know. It says career predictions are a great part of being a kid and staying optimistic about your future, but the reality is you're probably going to have many jobs throughout your life. Some you'll like more than others. That's really wise. The coolest heatwave ever is a trek to the end of the field for water, framed as a journey across the desert. The staging and effects are great, and wonderfully sell how dire the situation is, at least in the kids' imaginations. They really do have a big field. The Big Prank and The Madness of King Bob are stories about 10-year-old Bob facing that he's getting old and a new generation is emerging. The Big Prank is a fun rivalry between him and DJ, while The Madness is about him denying, bargaining, and accepting TJ's superiorities. I thought King Bob could be a rather compelling character in his own right, so I welcome spotlight episodes like these. Gretchen and the Secret of Yo is one I'm sure everyone has seen. Just a fun competition episode with Gretchen needing to master yo-yos. She's given guidance from a former yo-yo champion, Tommy Tate, played impeccably by Brian Doyle Murray. As great of a smart, science-oriented character Gretchen is, seeing her partake in an activity like this was refreshing. Gus's Last Stand is a bully episode. Those were pretty hard to mess up at this time, and this is one that goes for that early prison movie style, while still making Gus want to be a hero to the other kids and his father. It's just missing dodgeballs. The first picture show sees TJ and Prickly fight about their love of Senior Fusion comics, because every cartoon in the late 90s and early 2000s needed a fictional superhero franchise. Everyone but Prickly wants to skip school to go to the new Senior Fusion movie, and it's about time Prickly opened up to his inner child. Willingly this time. Economics of Recess is one of the show's more biting satires. TJ gets swept up in a hip new Japanese trading card game, they had shockingly good timing, and gets thrown through all the dreams and nightmares of Western economics. It's one of their more on-the-nose pieces, but I'd take clear advice over bad advice. Rainy Days combines the disappointment of staying inside for days on end with the horror vibes of isolation and loss of spirit. What they were able to make was very gripping, even if it comes off as adorable now. 5 days inside is torture for them? Principal for a Day is the best of the TJ Prickly rivalry episodes. Prickly lets TJ take his job and makes him slowly turn into the very thing he hates, a stuck-up, selfish old man. This was much more dramatic and complete than their previous Mad with Power effort, and firmly solidified the series' greatest dynamic. I love the C-Note for being such a tried and true traditional slice-of-life story. The gang discovers $100, and their imaginations run wild on all the things they can get for $17 each. But it all turns out to be a big game of honesty on the part of a rich person who left the bill. Very funny, very eccentric, but also a good story about being careful with money. They've learnt better. My favourite episode of the whole show is Season 1's Speedy, We Hardly Knew Ye, a heart-wrenching, mysterious, and silly tale about the 4th grade class's recently deceased hamster, and its impact on multiple generations of 3rd Street students. The explanation for Speedy's long legacy is great, as are the ways everyone deals with his passing. It's about a dead hamster, but is able to work pathos out of it. That's impressive. I love all these episodes and their stories, but here are 6 I'm less crazy about. King Gus is self-explanatory, another Mad with Power shebang. Like a lot of weaker examples of the story, it doesn't feel like Gus's rise in tyranny is natural or justified. Officer Mikey is a really long, drawn-out parody of policies, agreements, and networks and all that junk. And with Mikey changing his mind about wanting to be a crossing guard, it makes most of the episode feel like a waste of time. I get that's the joke, but I wasn't as amused as I could have been. YOPE from Norway is another weaker Gus episode, and one I think would have better fit Spinelli or Randall. A foreign exchange students come over, and Gus pretty much tries to keep him from reaping his own benefits of being the new kid. You know, the benefits? I can imagine a much better version of this episode where Gus keeps trying to keep YOPE from going through the bad stuff. That would be a lot more understandable. LAWSON and his crew is the weakest of the half-hour episodes because it's pretty dragged out, and the eponymous LAWSON and crew aren't very interesting. There's a bit of that recess spirit lurking at the end, but you have to get through a lot of predictable bigger fish schlock first. The biggest trouble ever is a much bigger conflict than we've ever seen before, and in my opinion, bigger than the show could have handled, especially in an 11-minute episode. The gang's put on trial for breaking a statue and are almost separated by a bunch of hypocritical bureaucrats who played on the statue as kids too. People like the extra tension and general commentary here, but I found it to be far removed from my favorite aspects of the show. Sorry. But my least favorite episode was Copycat Kid, another one that doesn't need much explanation. I didn't feel like Mikey and Vince had much chemistry, and testing it with a copycat episode didn't help. Recess originally entered production in early 2000, at 65 episodes made across around 4 production blocks. And it was going to cap off with a big theatrical movie in Recess School's Out. Before I say anything about the plot, the biggest problem with this movie is that it was put on the silver screen. Nothing about Recess screams theatrical, and I think I'd be more forgiving on its animation if it was a TV movie or direct-to-video. This is no Emperor's New Groove. And the story's of that more surreal flavor, but at least takes a little longer to go all over the place. As the title would suggest, school's out, and TJ's devastated that all his friends are going to different summer camps, but are called back together when TJ starts noticing strange things going on inside the school. Usually it's locked up for summer break, but he notices a bunch of scientists inside operating tractor beams and disintegration rays. We learn it's Principal Prickly's old friend, Dr. Benedict, voiced by James Woods, planning to send the Earth into another ice age and end summer vacations and recess forever. Again, this takes place in the same kind of reality as School World, very unrealistic and more threatening. At least it's a good movie on Prickly's behalf. He comes up against the ultimate corrupt authority figure in Dr. Benedict, who James Woods plays pretty well, and delivers a great speech to TJ about how he misses being a kid as much as TJ will. This movie has a couple good moments like that, but kind of flounders in making an overall point. There's a lot of sneaking, chasing, and driving, so you can count on it being an action-packed movie, but it never becomes anywhere near as relatable or clever as the show. It's weird that the things I remember the most are TJ's older sister Becky, voiced by Melissa Joan Hart, and Mikey's cover of Green Tambourine during the credits. The latter because it's a fun retro sequence that leaves you feeling good, and the former because I like Becky's dynamic with TJ. Of course someone like him would have an older sister who won't put up with his monkey shines. Unfortunately, she's a Mindy situation, and she only appears one more time after this, voiced by Tara Strong, who might as well voice your life story. You heard right, this wasn't the finale after all. The Recess franchise managed to live on for a few more years. There was a Christmas special released on VHS that November, which is basically a clip show, but then the show was outright renewed for more episodes, but not before Disney or ABC got cold feet and cancelled the series again. These episodes were released on 2 DVDs on December 9th, 2003, All Grow Down and Taking the 5th Grade. And yep, their continuation's made after a 2-year hiatus, alright? All Grow Down is half clip show and half origin story for the Recess gang, which reveals that Gus knew them in kindergarten, but he moved out again and they forgot him before he moved back again in The New Kid. It heavily implies this is real, which isn't complete nonsense since kids their age would forget their time in kindergarten, but it is a tough thing to accept. Namely, why did Gus seem like he didn't know them in The New Kid, and why was he the only one to remember it? The story is fine for a kindergarten set story. I guess Paul and Joe were feeling more nostalgic for their time on Rugrats. It's just weird that it's its own movie, clip show, flashback, Frankenstein's monster of special ideas. Taking the 5th grade was a much better effort. We get 3 potential season 7 episodes back to back. No more school, where TJ can't take the pressure of being a 5th grader, and protests going back by locking himself in his room. A big reintroduction to a new status quo that returned to the satirical bent of the early seasons. 5th grade club, about the gang being introduced to a secret lounge that only the 5th graders can enter. Gus and Mikey of all people getting protective and snobbish is far-fetched, but I like the return of King Bob to lecture the new 6th graders to be more courteous. It's the weakest, but still okay. Then there's A Recess Halloween, where Spinelli gets depressed about growing up, and has to be convinced that she can still get into the Halloween spirit, as it defies age. This is the best of the bunch, and more or less the official end to everything. A surprising, fresh glimpse into what could have been, but ultimately wound up on video. But I remember Disney Channel would air it sometimes. I guess all that's left to talk about is Lax, the Lilo and Stitch crossover that aired on January 16th, 2006. Remember, that's more than 8 years after the show began. These characters had a reach. Being a crossover with a series about aliens invading Hawaii? No kidding, it's gonna be the weirdest romp of all. Kauai's newest threat is Experiment 285, Lax, who zaps people into relaxing hard and losing focus of their work. Only the Recess Gang and Miss Finster return, and unfortunately not everyone could reprise their roles, but this is still my favourite of the Lilo and Stitch crossovers. I think what works is that it fits Recess pretty well. They were all about missions and plans in favour of kidkind's freedom to playtime, so it's ironic that they all fall prey to, gasp, relaxing in Hawaii and having a good time. All except Gus and Gretchen, who get zapped, but problem solving is her way of chilling out. It really knew what made them tick. What a journey this show went on. From being an overnight hit for ABC, to an enduring franchise that entertained and taught millions. Being a critic of animated shows, I sometimes wonder if I should be this invested in these simple, colourful stories and characters as an adult, if there's other media I could be more satisfied by. But then I'll get to a show like Recess, which is just as much for adults as it is for children. What could have easily been brushed off as a Nicktoons wannabe ended up becoming one of the most influential and resonant cartoons in the Disney TV canon, and we had talented writers who self-admittedly couldn't draw to thank for that. Stay in school, hone your craft, and someday you might just create something that'll stick with countless people all over the world. Goodbye for now.
Prepare for some serious airbending action. Avatar: The Last Airbender is coming up next, right here on Nicktoons.